By the late 1850s, the boundary line between Canada and the United States was well established after 3/4 of a century of disputes, wars, and near wars. And yet, in a way, the struggle for a border was far from over. For one thing, Canada could still be a handy military target in any future quarrel between Britain and the United States. Also, there was a vast and still empty territory in the West, which was under British rule. What if this were to attract a great tide of American settlers? And then there was the economic factor. A decade earlier, there'd been depression in Canada, and this had led some influential Canadians to advocate joining the richer United States. This annexationist movement was short-lived, and the Reciprocity Treaty of 1854 gave a great boost to trade between the two countries, helping to bring a measure of prosperity back to Canada. Trade, flowing north and south, flourished, but east-west trade within British North America, which was felt essential, was not developing quickly enough. Sheer size always seemed to give the Americans a great competitive advantage. Some Americans had seen reciprocity as a means of annexing Canada peacefully, and some Canadians would later wonder whether they had not been right.
The growing commercial centers of Canada West, Hamilton, London, and Toronto, reflected the prosperity of the years after the Reciprocity Treaty. And it was here that the first stirrings of ambition to expand Canada's territory westward began to appear. Books about the Great West aroused wide interest with their accounts of the prairies. For recent immigrants, there might be farms in this huge area that now supported only the Indian hunter and the buffalo. And for businessmen, settlers would mean more markets. This West was British, not American, and might be made Canadian. Surely it could someday be put to far more profitable use than this. Here was room to expand a Canada that was still little more than a thin strip of land from Quebec to Detroit. For the Indian wanderers of these plains, the only white authority so far was represented by the Hudson's Bay Company, whose forts and outposts had a monopoly on the fur trade in this region. In dealing with the Indians, the company's agents had almost 2 centuries of experience behind them, and they had worked out trading arrangements with a minimum of liquor and violence. The company had a clear-cut attitude toward the Indians, to preserve their status as hunters. In canoes paddled by their employees, Hudson's Bay agents traversed an empire west of the bay from the American border to Alaska. And with firm authority, they ruled this land on behalf of both the company and the crown. Settlers had not flourished in this fur country, and there were barely 1,000 from outside, mostly around Fort Garry. In addition, there were the Métis, a more indigenous group descended from Europeans who had married Indians. They were independent-minded people, mostly interested in hunting the buffalo and doing some trading. But agriculture on the vast prairie was a secondary interest. North of the prairies, the forests were a temptation for those hunters who cared little for the regulations of the Hudson's Bay Company. These free and independent spirits roamed an area too big for the company to control and sought ways to sell their furs outside the monopoly. It was illicit, but far more profitable for the hunters. The 1850s brought a considerable increase in the number of unlicensed hunters operating in the company's northern territory. For now, there were other buyers of furs across the border in fast-growing Minnesota. The capital of Minnesota, St. Paul, was 500 miles south of Fort Garry, but it was quite accessible to Métis and their carts. In Washington, over the years, federal authorities had worked steadily to reconcile the Indians to white settlement in the Northwest. By 1837, treaties had opened up lands directly south of Fort Garry, and by 1849, the territory of Minnesota had been established. Then came further concessions by the Indians that seemed to mark their final acceptance of American authority. The white population grew to 150,000, and in 1858, Minnesota became a full-fledged state with appropriate fanfare. A populated Minnesota brought an end to the old isolation of the British West and a new challenge to the monopoly of the Hudson's Bay Company. Long rows of Métis carts were soon operating on a big scale along regular routes, bringing both legal and illicit goods to St. Paul, where they could be loaded onto Mississippi steamboats. In sharp contrast, the route from the British West to the boundary of Canada proper could still be traversed only by canoes, not by steamboats. It was difficult and often dangerous. In the late 1850s, the Canadian government sent an expedition to the West to look for ways to compete with St. Paul, perhaps even through the creation of an overland route. The expedition had been inspired by expansionists in Canada who dreamed of a much larger country. At the same time, John Palliser was exploring the buffalo country, investigating agricultural possibilities for British interests. The buffalo seemed numberless, but they were being hunted so mercilessly that they were starting to show the first ominous signs of decrease. For the Indians of the plains, the winds of change were beginning to be felt. Settlement might still be far off, but the white man's interest was a source of worry. The last big step in fixing the boundary had come when Britain and the United States extended the 49th parallel line to the Pacific. What remained to Britain in the far west was a spectacular region of snowy peaks, spreading forests, and racing rivers. It was an unspoiled sanctuary for fish and for fur-bearing animals, and for the Indian tribes that hunted them. The Hudson's Bay Company ruled here, too, and in 1843, the company built Fort Victoria on Vancouver Island. A few years later, Britain made the island a crown colony, and settlement was to be encouraged to offset American growth in adjacent Oregon. But the administration of the colony was in the hands of the Hudson's Bay Company, whose main interest was in the nearby mainland with its rich store of furs. As always, it was this, not farming, that motivated the company. And so Victoria remained stagnant. But then came electrifying news. Gold had been discovered. The harbor came to life as the news spread, and thousands of fortune hunters poured in. The miners were almost all Americans, and by the end of the first year of the gold rush, some 20,000 of them had passed through the port of Victoria. They were on their way to the mainland of what is now British Columbia, where the gold was. Over tortuous mountain trails and across tumbling rivers, the lust for gold drove the prospectors into deadly dangers. Authority, in the form of James Douglas, governor of Vancouver Island, had reluctantly licensed American ships to carry passengers to the gold fields. Here in the interior was a huge area that was technically outside Douglas's jurisdiction, and it looked as though the Americans were taking over. On the Fraser River, an American-style town called Yale sprang up in an area where the British had not yet created a government. Alarmed that the Americans might set up their own, Douglas assumed the reins of government himself without waiting for authorization and showed the flag. And he was vindicated when London hastily created the colony of British Columbia and invited Douglas to be its first governor. Two years later, another wave of American fortune hunters poured into the Caribou area, where there had been new discoveries of gold. Now, they were no longer operating in a political vacuum, but under firm British rule. Yet the miners were naturally American in outlook, and for the moment, the new colony was really part of the great American frontier.
Thus, the struggle for a border did, in a sense, continue. West of the Great Lakes, there was a growing connection between Minnesota and the British territory to the north. This link would give the Americans an advantage in any future competition with Canadian expansionists who were eyeing the British West from Toronto. And in the far west, British Columbia was largely populated by Americans who someday might want to come under Washington's wing. As for Canada proper in the east, she was always a possible victim if the United States and Britain ever came to blows. But avoiding this had been British policy, and now in the 1850s, it looked as though real Anglo-American friendship might be at hand.
America's brother Jonathan found that Britain's John Bull seemed willing to put aside past animosities. And in 1855, there came a gesture from the United States that was perhaps symbolic. It involved the Resolute, an Arctic exploration ship that the British had had to abandon in the far north. She had drifted south and had been salvaged by an American whaler. The American government bought the Resolute and returned her to Britain as a gift. But in England, preparations were underway for an event that seemed even more significant for Anglo-American friendship. For they were getting ready to lay the first transatlantic cable. There was something miraculous about the unwinding of this fragile link across 2,000 miles of dark ocean floor, and its progress was followed with passionate interest. When it was finally brought ashore in North America, there were tremendous celebrations, and in New York, a triumphal parade down Broadway. The cable engineers accomplished their feat in an age that worshiped progress. Better communications could only mean better understanding, and cartoonists were sure that the Atlantic had now become a friendly pond. A majestic ship to carry a royal traveler, the Prince of Wales, who came to North America in 1860. In Halifax, the crowds knew that this unprecedented visit by a future king meant recognition of the growing importance of British North America. And they responded by making it clear to Britons and Americans alike that they still preferred monarchy to republicanism. In Quebec, too, there were believers in monarchy to welcome the royal visitor, although they might regret that the prince in question was not French. But he was received with friendly politeness. And in Montreal, there were cheers for His Royal Highness, especially when he paid tribute to one of the engineering marvels of the age, driving home the last rivet in the new Victoria Bridge. And in Ottawa, just for fun, the prince had a ride on that great Canadian institution, the timber raft. After his Canadian tour, the prince went to Washington, and there the future King of England met President Buchanan, who assured him of American friendship. But what was really revealing was the enthusiastic reception given to the prince in several American cities. The people had forgotten how their grandfathers hated King George III. And when the prince bowed his head at the tomb of George Washington, it looked as though the old Anglo-American hostility had at last come to an end. But the southern states were not on the itinerary of the young prince, so he never saw the luxurious facade of the Old South or the sinister foundation of slavery on which it rested. In 1860, there were almost 4 million slaves in the 16 states where slavery was legal and where Negroes were advertised for sale like any other merchandise. Many of the founding fathers of the Republic had deplored this trade in human beings and had hoped that the slaves would slowly be freed. But instead, slavery grew, especially after the invention of the cotton gin. This machine had made cotton growing immensely profitable, leading to huge plantations that wanted more and more Negroes. But slavery tormented the consciences of many Americans, like William Lloyd Garrison, who led a movement for its abolition. For white opponents of slavery, the fact that the country was divided into a slave area and a free area offered an opportunity to do something about it. Over the years, the Underground Railway had been developed, a number of secret routes over which runaway slaves could flee to sanctuary in the North, with the help of sympathizers along the way. But after 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, called kidnapping by its opponents, permitted the pursuit and arrest of runaway slaves who had reached the North. It meant new terrors for those who sought freedom. Public opinion in the North was aroused by ugly incidents involving the activities of the slave catchers. Determined to block enforcement of the law, many Northerners helped to extend the Underground Railway into Canada, where slavery was illegal and where there could be no extradition. Thus, in the 1850s, several thousand slaves who had been hounded across the United States finally found a haven in Canada. Meanwhile, Uncle Tom's Cabin had become the bestseller of the age, with its story of Topsy and Little Eva and its indictment of slavery. And its readers were deeply moved by the plight of Eliza pursued by bloodhounds. In the North, stage plays often dealt with the brutality of slave owners, with their whips and branding irons. Public opinion was inflamed, and there was a claim for crusaders like John Brown, whose anti-slavery raid in Virginia led to his execution and everlasting renown. So great were the passions of the day that Senator Charles Sumner, an abolitionist, was beaten up on the very floor of the Senate. His attacker was Senator Charles Brooks of South Carolina, a man in the tradition of the famous John Calhoun, bitter apologist of the South. Slavery was paternalistic and a positive good, according to John Calhoun. But he also called it a practical necessity if the South was to flourish. For the production of cotton had reached immense proportions, and there were huge fortunes to be made in supplying the mills of New England and Britain. This wealth had given the South the arrogance of a spoiled child. Southern bullying of the North went so far as to involve federal government officials in the Ostend Manifesto, a sinister document calling for the annexation of Cuba, which would become American slave territory. This aggressiveness arose from a vision of the South's manifest destiny, which dreamed of a huge, independent slaveholding area stretching from Kansas down into Latin America. But Abraham Lincoln was determined to prevent the expansion of slavery. This Illinois lawyer was the Republican candidate for the presidency, and many in the South clearly saw him as their nemesis, a man whose ideas would force them to desperate measures. And Lincoln's victory in the critical election of 1860 did hasten the hour of decision for the South. At the same time in Washington, William H. Seward was playing with the idea that provoking a foreign war might serve to avert a civil war in the United States. A leading Republican politician, Seward had often argued that the country must acquire more territory. Seward sounded as though he wanted to expand the United States all the way to the North Pole, and Canada's uneasiness increased when Seward became Lincoln's Secretary of State. Grandiose visions might now become policy. Soon after Lincoln's election, 7 Southern states quit the Union, and Jefferson Davis became their president in a convention at Montgomery, Alabama, where they met to create the Confederate States of America. Now there were 2 presidents, 2 nations. But Seward still wondered if the nation's sickness might not be healed by the tonic of expansion. And some northern newspapers saw another solution: abandon the South and take Canada as compensation. But in his inaugural address, President Lincoln made it clear that he wanted peace abroad and rejected a diversionary foreign adventure as a dishonorable way of settling a domestic problem. Fort Sumter, South Carolina, April 12, 1861. Confederate guns firing at a federal stronghold. The Civil War had begun. Far to the north, the Canadian landscape seemed tranquil and safely outside the path of the storm that was breaking south of the border. But the mood was not tranquil in the old fortress town of Quebec, where the authorities realized that the Civil War could spell trouble for Canada. Relations between Britain and the United States had greatly improved during the 1850s. But how would they fare now in the light of these terrible events? Thus, Canadians followed the news from the war with passionate interest and apprehension as the battles began. The Great Union, whose reality had so dominated Canadian affairs, now seemed to be fading away. Now there were 2 Americas, although the Union claimed full sovereignty and considered the Confederates mere rebels. But how would foreign nations see it? Were there not 2 governments and 2 embattled presidents? For Jefferson Davis presided at Richmond over a full-fledged capital with all the apparatus of state, while Abraham Lincoln held office in a Washington where the massive central dome of the Capitol remained ominously unfinished. Winfield Scott, the Union commander-in-chief, might seem more venerable than warlike, but the spirit of the North was surely youthful and vigorous. Most Canadians sympathized with the Union, and some even agreed that Jeff Davis was the devil incarnate, and that he would get the thrashing he deserved from an aroused and righteous North. In the North, draftees were allowed to hire substitutes to do their fighting for them, and many Canadians hired themselves out. Also, there were generous bounties to be had. Others were motivated by idealism, and by the end of the war, 50,000 Canadians had enlisted. But before long, Canadian enthusiasm for the Union was somewhat tempered by President Lincoln's statements, in which he kept emphasizing the need to preserve the Union, but seemed to neglect the desperate plight of the slaves. What kind of a man was Lincoln, Canadians wondered? Could this puzzling, unsophisticated backwoodsman control such subtle and dangerous men as William Seward, the Secretary of State who wanted Canada in the Union, or Seward's consul in Montreal, Joshua Giddings? Senator Sumner was a secret annexationist, and even General Scott might need restraining. For the map, as seen by Canadians, posed ominous possibilities. If the South won its independence, the Union might turn north for compensation. And if the North won, there might still be danger, for the newly strengthened United States, resuming its surge into the West, might choose to ignore the border. Many Northern expansionists shared the view expressed by Seward when he said that Canada was a fruit ready to drop into the American basket. And there was loud support from Irish-American groups with their hatred for Britain. Also, the Civil War itself was breeding a dangerous mood as the Eagle screamed at the Confederate traitors. And his proprietary notions about the whole Western Hemisphere were becoming inflamed as the conflict grew. But in British North America, there were now fewer than 5,000 regular troops in places like Quebec. If preparedness would deter American aggression, this preparedness was not obvious. Meanwhile, in London, Her Majesty's government proclaimed its neutrality in the Civil War, thus angering Seward, because this recognized the status of the South as a belligerent, not a mere rebel. And 2,000 British troops, with considerable fanfare, had boarded the Great Eastern on their way to reinforce Canadian garrisons. This greatest ship of its day had raced across the Atlantic in the record time of 8 days, a dramatic gesture to make it clear to the Americans that Britain was determined to defend her colonies. New troops, new weapons. Perhaps this would give pause to those American newspapers that said conquering Canada would be mere child's play. Now, from William Seward, there came orders to strengthen the defenses of strategic areas near the Canadian border. But for Canadians, it looked as though these might be springboards for invasion. And in John Bull's England, latent anti-Americanism began to stir. With thieves prowling, doors must be barred.
Lincoln's Union First policy had cooled the ardor of popular opinion in Canada. So while Canadians remained fundamentally pro-North, the Union cause had somehow lost its halo for them. Also, there were some who were sympathetic to the South. Canadian loyalists and British Tories were traditionally anti-American. And while this right-wing opinion stopped short of supporting slavery, it was soon supporting the South's right to rebel. But it was Seward who remained the main focus of official concern. If he had failed to sell Lincoln on a foreign adventure to save the Union, It was partly because he lacked a pretext for such an adventure. But there was good reason to believe that he might be looking for one. And suddenly, it arrived.
In the Confederate capital at Richmond, there was a burning desire for diplomatic recognition in Europe. So James Mason was sent to London and John Slidell to Paris. But the vessel they were on was stopped on the high seas by the Union warship San Jacinto, and the two Southern emissaries were taken back to the United States as prisoners. The fact that they had been removed from a British merchantman, the Trent, led to a diplomatic uproar, although the captain of the San Jacinto became a Union hero. In London, from where Britannia ruled the waves, this act against a British ship brought a bellow of rage. Uncle Sam, a pirate. That was how John Bull saw it. And Foreign Minister Russell called it intolerable. Prime Minister Palmerston indicated that Britain would demand satisfaction and would put the Navy on a war footing, designed to let the North know she meant business. In Britain, there was patriotic hysteria as reinforcements for Canada boarded the troop ships. There were some 14,000 of them, a very large force for the time, and there were horses and sleds for use at their destination. Then, in the depths of the Canadian winter, there began a long and arduous trip through the New Brunswick wilderness, as the British troops headed for the St. Lawrence Valley, gateway to strategic defense points. And as they marched, there was always the fear of attack from the state of Maine. A few of the troops became snowbound or had to turn back, but most of them eventually reached the railway at Rivière-du-Loup. Responsibility for the defense of Canada now rested with Lord Monck, the new Governor-General. He had just arrived when the news broke about the Trent affair. Monck was very aware of the dangers of the uproar in the press, and he kept his moves quiet, as much to prevent Canadian hysteria as American anger. But he quickly got his defenses in order, with special attention to points like the prized Victoria Bridge. And the arrival of British reinforcements helped him man key fortifications on the thinly guarded frontier. At the same time, there were plenty of enthusiastic amateurs ready to help. Meanwhile, in wintry New York and other American cities, no topic of conversation could compete with the Trent affair, for the mood was ultra-nationalist. The undisputed hero of the hour was Captain Wilkes, the man who had boarded the Trent. Had he not plucked those Confederate monkeys from the very pocket of that old villain, John Bull? But Mr. Bull could get angry, especially when asked to lick Uncle Sam's boots. John Bull was angry, and getting angrier. In fact, John Bull was ready for war. And in Washington, as far as Canadians were concerned, Lincoln was flanked by known annexationists. So American defense moves near the border looked sinister. Uncle Sam the pirate seemed in British eyes to be bound for collision with the honest British mariner. And on December 19th, a note demanding the release of the captured Confederate envoys was presented by the British ambassador to Secretary Seward. This must have made Uncle Sam's hair stand on end, according to a London cartoonist. The British public's readiness for war, it was hinted, was fully shared by Prime Minister Palmerston. He and John Bull had their sharpshooters' sights firmly trained on the hide of President Lincoln. But behind the scenes, men like Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, and the foreign minister himself, Lord Russell, held more moderate views. And attempts to placate the angry lion were being made by Richard Cobden, the anti-imperialist, who spoke vehemently against war. But the belligerent voices remained loudest. However, a harassed President Lincoln is reported to have said, "I think for us, it must be one war at a time." And his cabinet agreed to put the captured Confederate agents on a ship bound for Britain. It looked indeed like an American surrender, and the Tory press saw naughty Uncle Sam apologizing to Britannia. Lord Russell would not have to flog him after all. Britain had triumphed, but Tory gloating only served to further infuriate Northern opinion, and that could mean trouble for Canada. Thus, though bloodshed had been avoided, both sides maintained a warlike posture. And far north of the raging Civil War, forces on both sides of the border between Canada and the United States remained on the alert.
In the Civil War, early Confederate victories over the Union armies had made it easier for Seward to agree with Lincoln that it had better be one war at a time. Another factor which made it easier for the Americans to give in was the tenor of the British diplomatic note, for Prince Albert had persuaded Foreign Secretary Russell to tone it down so it would be coldly correct but not offensive. So Seward was never forced, technically, to apologize for the Trent affair. Thus, there was no war, but an ugly and dangerous mood remained. Northerners felt that the British Tories had shown their traditional anti-American hand. If they weren't as yet pro-South, they were certainly anti-North. But fortunately, there were countervailing forces at work in Britain.
The outcry in Britain over the Trent affair obscured the fact that opinion on the Civil War itself was divided along traditionally radical and conservative lines, although both sides opposed slavery, and the Navy had helped drive slave ships from the high seas. In England's cities, anti-slavery meetings revealed the depth of this conviction, and Richard Cobden's writings were avidly perused in the working-class reading rooms of Manchester. John Bright was another reformer who gave the British worker a clear image of the American tragedy, where there was an admirable ideal of liberty, but a dark shadow lurking behind it. Those who knew misery themselves could have no respect for an American liberty that in the South was nothing more than a mask for brutal domination. They felt the North, whatever its faults, could put an end to it. Liberal opinion in Britain could see the Civil War only as a clear-cut contest between slavery and anti-slavery. Nothing else mattered. But most of Britain's ruling class viewed the Civil War through less idealistic eyes. The Tory press, as well as the aristocracy and the business community, were able to adopt a detached attitude toward the great struggle across the Atlantic. For them, it became a straight power struggle, in which the Negro and his sufferings tended to fade out of the picture. This was a family quarrel, and it was obvious that Britain, caught between the scowls of Lincoln and the frowns of Davis, ought to steer the course of neutrality. The Queen had already proclaimed neutrality, and Jeff Davis, with his Confederate bonds and cotton, should be dealt with cautiously. But the North's petulant hints that neutrality wasn't good enough came to irritate Tory opinion. And soon there were portrayals of Lincoln as a wild man, bent on taking Canada. Meanwhile, Northern defeats in Civil War battles roused Tory sarcasm, and it was suggested that perhaps the Yankees would conquer Canada by retreating into it. The Lion's mood was changing. Britain's aristocracy had never been happy about the much-admired success of Yankee democracy, and most of them were not displeased to see a little trouble there. It was time people stopped adversely comparing the monarchy to the republic. Maybe the Lion didn't look so bad after all. Now the ghost of King George III could mock the ghost of George Washington. And by the second year of the war, feelings about Abraham Lincoln in Tory Britain could hardly be described as neutral. In the 1860s, Britain led the world in textile production, and her mills relied heavily on cotton from the American South. Thus, there was great anxiety among British businessmen when the Union naval blockade cut off Southern exports. Britain would soon be on its knees praying for cotton, or so the South hoped. Cotton was imprisoned, and its jailer was the North. The South hoped that Europe would insist that it be set free from the oppression of the Union with its blockading fleet. Meanwhile, Southern patriots sometimes burned their precious cotton rather than let Northern soldiers capture it. For Britain, it meant unemployment, with little cotton for the mills. Yet the hungry workers still supported the North. But for John Bull, it was cotton, not freeing the slaves, that really mattered. That was the way the cynics saw it. Where money was concerned, businessman Bull's ideals went out the door. Along the River Clyde in Scotland, there was a source of great help for the South. From the famous shipyards here came a number of fast vessels, especially built to run the northern blockade. There were fortunes to be made carrying all kinds of goods to the South, and it was at British colonial ports like Nassau that blockade runners met the overseas transports. But there were northern cruisers lurking in the vicinity, and there were many losses. The blockade runners, however, were often simply too fast to catch. For the North, these insolent ships were yet another British provocation. But Britain's efficient shipyards produced vessels even more troublesome to the Union, vessels like the notorious Alabama. She was a hit-and-run raider flying the Confederate flag, and in only 2 years, she destroyed 58 northern ships all over the world. In all, 257 Union ships were sunk by Confederate raiders, several of which were built in Britain. Uncle Sam was furious. John Bull, in his eyes, was nothing more than a supplier for pirates. And Mr. Bull, for his part, was steadily losing respect for the wild man in Washington. Long Abe Lincoln was an all-too-typical Yankee, full of braggadocio, trying to make defeat taste like victory. Lincoln was treated with ferocity by the British Tory press, which saw him doing a nationalist war dance, brandishing the anti-Canadian slogans of newspapers like the New York Herald. The North was fighting secession from the Union, not slavery, according to realists in Britain and France. And for Lord Palmerston and Napoleon III, there was no idealism in the Civil War, just a power struggle. And it seemed as though the South would have its way after all. For Jefferson Davis could point to a list of victories that might well make Lincoln cringe. Lincoln's hand was shaky, and the mistakes he was making were known to all England. Jefferson Davis. Would Palmerston now recognize the rebel leader diplomatically? Palmerston remained publicly neutral, but in private, the friends of the South were winning his ear. Lincoln was crushing America with casualties and taxes, according to his British critics. He was fighting this war with generals that were incompetent and a treasury that was almost bankrupt. And if Lincoln was almost at the point of collapse, so was his adversary, Jefferson Davis. Surely it was time for Britain and France to try to stop this war. But Palmerston and Russell moved cautiously, although they agreed that a proposal to mediate between North and South should soon be put before the cabinet. At the same time, William Ewart Gladstone, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, encouraged the South by proclaiming that it had created a nation. But Russell and Palmerston disavowed Gladstone's statement, and the two canny leaders decided to play Hamlet and delay their mediation proposal. They were waiting for news from the war. The newsboys of London were soon shouting it in the streets. The South had been stopped at Antietam. The Union Army had held its ground and had driven back General Robert E. Lee in one of the bloodiest battles in the history of warfare. Lincoln had risen like the phoenix against all predictions from his military ashes. And now he could turn to the problem he seemed to have forgotten, the slave. This could be his trump card in his deadly game against the formidable Jefferson Davis, or so some British observers saw it. For now, Davis had to face a brilliant ideological move, the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, slaves in rebel areas were free as far as the Union was concerned, much to the dismay of the South. Angry Southerners said it was just a desperate propaganda move. But the North's now formal role as champion of the oppressed was one that British leaders could not ignore. Popular response to the Emancipation Proclamation was so strong in England that the mediation proposal of Palmerston and Russell was never brought before the cabinet. And when the French persisted in advocating a mediation plan, the British remained aloof.
Actually, the Emancipation Proclamation had little practical meaning for the slaves at the time it was issued, as most of the slave-holding territory was still outside Northern control. But as a declaration of intention, it had great effect. The North was now officially fighting against slavery, and no foreign government could lightly support the side that was fighting for it. In Canada, only extreme Tories seemed pro-South, arguing that northern expansionism would always endanger Canada. But in truth, Canada's sentiments attached her to the northern cause, as did her economic interests, especially the Reciprocity Treaty. So Canadians had sighed with relief when British-American conflicts like the Trent Affair stopped short of war. But there was another diplomatic scare to come.
The crisis was again to be over ships, as the war at sea with both wooden and ironclad vessels grew ever more bitter. For the South was desperately trying to smash the northern blockade of its ports. The Confederate Navy had shown great ingenuity, but so far the North had been able to match it. So the South needed new stratagems. In Liverpool, these stratagems were being hatched with the help of obliging British shipbuilders, whose work greatly alarmed Charles Adams, Lincoln's ambassador. For the South had ordered rams, great naval swordfish with knife-like prows that were to rip through northern blockade ships and cause wide havoc. Fully realizing this, Adams told London that if the rams were allowed to leave England, it would mean war. But the British Navy was already keeping a close watch on the rams, and they were finally seized by a government that was now in no mood for war. For the Union, however, the incident was only one more item in the score against John Bull. In June 1864, the notorious Confederate raider Alabama was sunk by the Union's Kearsarge. But the Alabama had been built in Britain, and the vessels she had sunk were also added to the score against John Bull. In Britain, there was still unemployment, thanks to the blockade that kept the mills idle. But there was bread for relief, and it came from the north, where there was grain for export. Like it or not, John Bull had to lean on the Union. But he still lacked cotton, and as he watched the continuing American quarrel, John Bull decided that he had better find other suppliers. Fortunately, India and Egypt were ready with their fast-growing production. Soon, the eagerly sought fiber was on its way to Britain, not from Alabama and Georgia, but from Bombay and Alexandria, and it served to revive the mills of Lancashire. Now John Bull adopted a lordlier pose, above the fray. One naughty American boy was as bad as another, and neither of them had better tease the imperial lion. This, despite the fact that conspiracies between Britain and France were always being suspected by Uncle Sam. For one British cartoonist, North and South had now both become shrill fishwives, pouring abuse on a stolid John Bull. But there might be some comfort in this for Lord Russell, for disapproval by both sides meant that he was managing nicely to steer the course of neutrality through these dangerous waters. During 1863, Canada remained heavily garrisoned, cautiously alert. Lord Monck, the Governor-General, felt it unwise to relax his defenses, even though northern military energies were now totally absorbed by the fury of the Civil War. The South was fighting with frenzied desperation as superior northern resources at last came into play on the battlefields. In June of '63, Lee once more invaded the North amid general alarm. A month later, a tighter Union draft law aroused bitter charges of inequality, and for 4 days, mobs looted and burned in New York. Troops had to be diverted from the front to quell the violence. But despite these troubles, the Union's forces grew and grew, with new levies building up an army that was fast becoming the best in the world. For Lord Monck, this growing strength brought a disturbing vision of a neighboring nation where everybody seemed to have a gun. What if these guns were to aim at Canada after the Civil War to settle old scores? This was the worry that kept haunting the Governor General.
Canada herself had given the North little cause for real anger. She had clearly been alert to danger, but her attitude had been defensive, not hostile. The real problem for Canada had been the revival of hostility between the United States and Britain. Actually, there was a lot less official British hostility than the North thought there was. The aristocracy might sentimentalize about the gallant South, and the Tory press might make fun of Lincoln, but Palmerston and Russell had remained scrupulously correct. But they were realists, and when they were convinced the South would prevail, their desire to bring an end to hostilities was simply a polite way of trying to persuade the North to recognize the facts of life. To the North, however, mediation was a vicious pro-Confederate stratagem. So Lord Monck did have reason to worry. If the United States decided to settle its score with Britain after the Civil War, the Americans might once again try to visit the sins of the father on the son. And the son, of course, was Canada.